The war in Ukraine has just reached an inflection point. Ukraine now has the capability and approval to strike military targets inside of Russia. Now, when I say inflection point, what I mean is that significant change is about to occur on the battlefield. This does not mean that Ukraine is on the verge of winning, that Russia is on the verge of losing, anything like that. Simply that the way that the war has been going just changed with this new capability. So last month, U.S. President Joe Biden kind of quietly announced that Ukraine would now be able to launch U.S.-supplied weapons at military targets inside of Russia. This followed Russia's incursion into the Kharkiv area of northeastern Ukraine. And we'll pull a map up here to give a brief overview of that location. It's these two red dots between Belgorod and Kharkiv. Red dots, as you zoom in, they get bigger and bigger. This is an area where Russia pushed across the border and gained territory relatively rapidly. In the last couple weeks, it does look like Ukraine has halted this advance and Russian forces are no longer pushing forward. However, this movement into Ukrainian territory prompted President Biden to then authorize Ukrainian forces to conduct strikes into Russia, specifically in this area of the front. So it was tied directly to this Russian actions. So again, when that news came out, officials at the time said that Ukraine was authorized to strike targets inside of Russia near the border with the Kharkiv region. So again, tied here specifically, which was a big step to be able to use U.S.-provided munitions inside of Russian territory, but that's just a tiny fraction of the overall front, right? There's a lot of other areas where Ukraine could benefit from striking inside of Russian territory. But this appears to have changed just in the last 24 hours. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, quote, "This is not about geography, it's about common sense. If Russia is attacking or about to attack from its territory into Ukraine, it only makes sense to allow Ukraine to hit back against the forces that are hitting it from across the border." Sullivan added that Ukraine could also use air defense systems to fire at Russian planes flying in Russian airspace if they are about to fire into Ukrainian airspace. So a quick note on what has been acceptable so far in terms of the use of these Western-supplied weapons. Heading back to the map, again, this is Deep State Map, a publicly available resource. So a lot of weapons, Western-provided weapons, have been flowing into Ukraine, and there's been generally restrictions on how they can be used. At baseline, there have been no restrictions on their use inside of Ukrainian territory. So looking at this map, it's everything in tan inside of Ukraine, and then the green areas are territory that Ukraine has liberated from Russian forces. So anything HIMARS, ATACMS, Storm Shadows, and the like can be used in those areas. Generally speaking, there's been no pushback on the use of any of these munitions in any of the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea. So I know this is a hotly contested one that Russia views entirely as their territory, but for a long time now, Ukraine has been using ATACMS, Storm Shadows, and other Western-supplied weapons to strike inside of Crimea, as well as all of this Russian-occupied territory in the south and east of the country. It appears that there's been no restrictions on that. Now, for quite a while now, there has been a lot of argument that Ukraine should be authorized to use Western-supplied weapons to strike inside of Russian territory, but the individual countries that are supplying those weapons have been slow to grant that approval. That's worth noting here. A lot of times we tie NATO directly to some of these decisions. NATO is helping to facilitate some of these transfers, coordinating between Ukraine and the various partner countries as to what Ukraine needs on the battlefield. But when a Storm Shadow arrives in Ukraine, it's not up to NATO for what Ukraine can or cannot use that for. It's up to the supplier of that weapon system. In that case, it would be the United Kingdom. Same thing for ATACMS. That's not up to NATO to decide what can or cannot be struck. That's up to the provider of that weapon system, the United States. Now, the reason that I say this decision is an inflection point is because Russia has changed how they're operating in this war. In the early days, they were using fixed and rotary wing aircraft to fly right up to the front to engage Ukrainian forces, kind of how we would expect air power to be used in a war. But as Ukrainian air defenses kind of beefed up across the country, as more Western systems flowed in, these Russian aircraft were forced to fire from more of a standoff position, which pretty significantly decreased their effectiveness. Now, to solve that issue, Russia has developed what they call a UMPK kit, or glide bomb attachments, for their fixed-wing aircraft to deploy. Now, we just had a video come out yesterday, according to Rybar. This is the first confirmed use of the FAB 3000, which is an M54 aerial bomb outfitted with one of these UMPK kits. They say in this video here, the target was the position of the armed forces of Ukraine in a medical facility in Liptsev. Now, these have developed over the last few months. It's been a significant threat to Ukrainian forces, so much so that when Ukraine withdrew from Avdiivka in February 2024, the overall commander of Ukrainian armed forces, General Syrskyi, cited these FAB bombs, glide bombs, as one of the major reasons they had to leave those positions. Now, these UMPK kits, it's nothing groundbreaking. Glide bombs have been around for quite a while. It's not necessarily a new technology. Russia has developed this themselves here in the last few months, specifically to deal with the issues they're facing on the Ukrainian battlefield. This UMPK kit, it's relatively crude wing attachments. We've got some pictures here to show what those look like. They do come with a guidance kit, so they're guided weapon systems that can be pretty accurate at range, all things considered, and they're becoming more and more accurate for what it's worth. When these first entered the battlefield, you were talking about sometimes they would strike within a kilometer of the target. More and more, we're seeing them impact within 20, 30 meters of the desired point of impact, which is often enough when you're talking about hundreds or even thousands of pounds for a bomb. Now, the challenge with these glide bombs is that they're harder to shoot down, they're less detectable to air defenses, and again, they do pack a pretty serious punch. Some of these can carry between 500 kilograms and 1.5 tons of explosives and have a range of over 60 kilometers. Now, the way these glide bombs work, a traditional aircraft drops a bomb, it doesn't fall straight down per se, right? The aircraft is moving forward. You've got some physics involved there, so it is going to pitch forward a little bit. These glide bombs with their attachments, as these wings kick out, allow the bomb to glide for a longer distance, which is why all of a sudden these aircraft are able to, releasing it in a certain manner. It's not just dropping it, but kind of pitching it out in front of them can get these things going 60. I've heard upwards of 80 kilometers away to strike some of these targets. That's a significant threat in a lot of ways, right? Now, if we go back to the map here to show what that's doing, specifically in the Kharkiv direction, when you're talking about a 60-kilometer range on some of these glide bombs, cut that in half just to be safe, right? You don't usually want to fire munitions at their max range, but some of these distances that Russia has pushed into, it's just, even right here, you go 10 kilometers back and you're inside of Russian airspace. So it's no issue for Russia to be launching these bombs from 20, 30 kilometers inside of Russian-controlled territory, inside of Russian airspace, where Ukraine was not really able to conduct strikes up until recently. Now, I do want to mention that we have seen a handful of these glide bombs impacting inside of Russian territory. I've heard a number recently that it was like 60 in the last month. That seems awfully high, but there's definitely been a handful. And the reason for that is if you look at these kits, it's entirely possible that sometimes they fail. Our own bombs fail in the United States. Things happen and wings don't deploy or guidance systems don't work. Any number of things can happen with these munitions. So you got to think if a bomb is being dropped, you're going to want to have kind of two planned points of impact. One is the actual target location that could be 30, 40 kilometers away. The other is a point of impact. What happens if the wings don't deploy or something goes wrong, right? If this bomb falls like a normal bomb instead of a glide bomb. And what we've seen is it looks like some of these areas, especially in Kharkiv, Russia is bombing these Ukrainian positions, and they're dropping the glide bombs kind of north of Belgorod up here. And when those wings don't deploy, which is happening at a rate, it's not zero, those bombs, massive bombs, 500 to 3,000 kilogram bombs, which a note for what it's worth. I feel like it's not 3,000 kilograms. I've heard mixed reactions. It might be 1.2 or 1,200 kilograms. But either way, big bombs. And when those wings don't deploy, they're falling inside of populated areas in Russia. So again, from a U.S. perspective, when we use precision munitions like this to a degree, we generally have a cone to identify if the guidance system doesn't kick in, it's going to fall within this area. And you want to know for certain if there's friendlies in that area, and you generally choose an attack heading to make sure that even if the guidance system fails, it's not going to impact in the middle of a crowded area. It doesn't look like, from what we've seen, that Russia has necessarily been utilizing that same tactic, and there have been a handful of cases of these glide bombs impacting inside of Russian territory. Now, this has posed a significant challenge for Ukraine for a couple of reasons here, right? They're able to drop these bombs. Russia's able to drop these bombs outside of the range of Ukraine's short-range air defense and inside of Russian territory. So to deal with these, again, it is very, very challenging. It doesn't sound like Ukraine has really developed a system to be able to shoot down these glide bombs effectively. So to have to deal with these, they have to engage the aircraft. But those aircraft are outside the range of short-range air defense systems and deep inside of Russian territory, which means you have to move something like the Patriot close to the front to be able to engage these Russian targets. And that's if you're shooting them in the air, right? We still have the conversation of if these, Su-34s and Su-35s are being used on a daily basis to drop bombs inside of Ukraine and they're taking off from Russian airfields, doesn't it make sense to target that Russian airfield while they're on the ground, maybe an ATACMS or a Storm Shadow? This announcement by the White House recently opens that possibility up as well. Right? It's not just waiting for those bombs to be flying overhead and trying to find a way to shoot them down, which, again, has not been developed yet, it doesn't look like, or at least in quantity. Why not, one, shoot those aircraft down while they're on their way to drop the bombs while still inside Russian territory, or strike those aircraft while they're on the ground at a variety of Russian airfields well inside the range of ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. So again, this recent announcement by the United States, I think, marks an inflection point. The capability and the approval for Ukraine to strike targets inside of Russian territory, be it airfields housing these aircraft for the FAB bombs specifically, or then shooting down the Su-34, Su-35s, and others flying to Ukrainian airspace to drop these bombs, that is going to change how Russia has to operate. My guess is sometime in the next few weeks, we'll start to see either airfields being hit or Russian jets being shot down. That's generally how this works, and then Russia will adapt accordingly. But either way, it's going to be a change. You have to expect some sort of change in the battlefield and how this war plays out going forward. Now, this whole decision here does not come without risk, and one of the major risks from day one about allowing, first off, providing any Western weapons to Ukraine to be used against Russian forces, even inside of Ukrainian territory, and then expanding that out to striking targets inside of Russia, is the concern of what does Russia do and how do they respond to that, and do they carry out attacks against Ukraine in response, or do they try to do something against the provider of those weapon systems? The United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, and others. So in line with that, Russian President Vladimir Putin just gave a speech a couple days ago, kind of wrapping up a trip that he visited North Korea. Some interesting video there, for what it's worth. The motorcade was seizure-inducing, and giant pictures of Putin and Kim Jong-un. Anyways, wrapped up a trip to Vietnam, and he gave a speech where he said, "The West say they want to achieve strategic defeat of Russia on the battlefield. What does this mean for Russia? For Russia, this means the end of its statehood. This means the end of the 1,000-year history of the Russian state. I think this is clear to everyone." And then the question arises, why should we be afraid? Isn't it better for us to go to the end? This is elementary formal logic. He says, we know that potential adversaries working on it, related to lowering the threshold for using nuclear weapons. We are thinking about what could be changed in the nuclear doctrine. So right there, I've pushed back in previous videos saying Ukraine is not an existential threat to Russia, that if they were forced to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, even Crimea, does not mean the collapse of the Russian state, not by a long shot. This is Putin saying otherwise, presenting the war in Ukraine as, hey, if we don't win this, it means the strategic defeat of the Russian military, and that means the end of our state. He's kind of putting it all on the line, right? We have to be successful here, and it's the big bad West trying to make sure that we are not. In fact, he's arguing that Western nations here are trying to find ways to use nuclear weapons at a lower threshold than currently exists. He was asked specifically whether Ukraine's use of Western long-range weapons against Russian territory could be considered an act of aggression, and he responded saying this requires additional research, but it's close. And we've heard those threats from day one. It's nothing new, but this is potentially a new step in that direction, right? If Western-supplied weapons are striking targets inside of Russia, shooting down aircraft over Russian territory on a regular basis, that is another step in this escalation game, if you will, trying to toe the line of what all parties deem as acceptable versus something that requires a significant response. This is another step in that direction. So again, very notable development from my perspective that Ukraine is now able to strike targets inside of Russian territory. Anything that is essentially going to be used in the war against Ukraine, that's a lot. It really opens up a lot of target possibilities for Ukraine and could inflict significant damage on the Russian armed forces and their ability to conduct this war at the front. But at the same time, Putin's keeping an eye on it and suggesting that this might be the United States and others trying to lower the nuclear threshold to end the Russian state. We have to be careful with how much is just words versus he actually believes. But from what I've seen, this is kind of the first time he's presenting the war in Ukraine as the West's desire to see the end of Russia, which kind of puts them in a corner and, to his point, brings about everything is on the table. We'll do whatever we have to exist. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. We just had an article a couple days ago talking about the Russian Navy in Cuba and what that means. Turns out we survived and World War III didn't start, so we went into some background on what that exercise is all about and what it means for the future of U.S.-Russia relations, as well as quite a few other topics we hit on a regular basis. Of course, linked in the description if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.